All right, so today I'm going to talk about how to overcome the mental gutter, aka hitting the wall, aka being up shit creek, aka wanting to fucking give up because it's too hard. That's what we're going to talk about today. I love this because for me, like the mental gutter, being able to overcome those moments where you feel like you can't do this anymore, where it feels so horrible, and then you get through it and you look back on that and that sense of pride that you have when you've overcome that's an awesome feeling. And I want other people to experience that feeling. One of two things is going to happen when you hit the wall or you're in the mental gutter, as we're calling it today, is you're either going to give up or you're going to overcome it. That's it. There's no other option. You're either moving past it or you're giving up. So today's all about tactics and tricks and tips you can use to move past it rather than, essentially bitch out of the challenge, right? So yes, I'm talking about this from like a physical endurance point of view. However, these lessons are all transferable. Ice baths, hard conversations, anything that requires a level of eating shit, this is going to be useful for, okay? So just specifically, I'm going to talk about the mental gutter, right? The mental gutter here is essentially a place where you feel like you're so overwhelmed with thoughts, pains, and emotions that you don't know what to do. So what it does is it skews your mentality, it skews your wants and desires, and it makes you think that you should stop. So you'll justify things to yourself, you'll be really hard done by, you'll say it's not even that important to you, and then you'll basically find your way of quitting this challenge or not doing this hard thing, which is what we don't want. Now, why should you learn tactics to overcome this? Pretty much if you've got any desire to do anything hard ever, you're going to need to understand how to overcome this at some point, right? So I want to talk about the different types of mental gutters. So I've named these for myself, but I want to share them with you today. So there's three gutter types. There's the anxious gutter, the pain gutter, and the depression gutter. There's a fourth, which is all of them, but we're just going to focus on these three for now. So the anxious gutter is like a place where you go in your mind where things physically aren't that bad, right? Like physically you feel okay. However, you're mentally not right. So for an example of this, I have a really good example for me. So when I was doing the 100-kilometer carpool over 2 days, I was about 2-3 hours into the challenge. Now, physically, I've prepared for 9 months for this, even more. I felt great in my body. I wasn't even that tired. However, I started getting in my own head and I started thinking, like, the pace that I'm going at is slower than what I've expected. I'm not going to be able to do this. I'm going to let everyone down. And I started anxious spiraling, and that became a wall. And that's a really good example of the anxious gutter, because the anxious gutter, you might not actually be in a state physically that is a problem, but your mental state is causing all of your physical problems. So you got to watch out for that one. Now, the next one is the pain gutter. This is things like you've got pain in your legs, you've got pain in your arms, you've got blisters, you've got things that you feel are too bad to continue or are causing you too much discomfort that you feel like you can't do this anymore. Now, the last one is the depression gutter. The depression gutter is kind of like a mix of just pure sadness. Like I'm explaining this from experience here, but I've been in points in my life where I've been doing these challenges or something hard, and I've just had no sleep. I've had no sleep. I'm exhausted. That's when the depression gutter sinks in. It's just this sense of sadness. You lose in touch of why you wanted to do this in the first place, and you just become a big sack of shit, really. So those are the three gutters. Now, the fourth one, which I'm kind of joking around about, but it does happen, is being up shit creek, is when you've got all three of them at once, and that definitely does happen. But most of the time, you get a combination of like one or two, and one of them is more prevalent than the other. So a marathon's always a good way to explain this, right? Because people can understand running. So if you think about a marathon is a 42K race. Now, most people hit a wall around that 30-ish mark, right? Now, around that 30-ish mark is usually when you've lost all glycogen at this point and you start getting cramps, you start physically becoming more exhausted. So therefore you feel like you can't achieve this anymore. That's hitting the wall from like a physical point of view. The anxious point of view on a run would be like you're 10Ks in and you just can't imagine doing another 32Ks. It's unfathomable, uncomprehendable amount of time left for you. So you give up based off nothing essentially. So now if we think about what actually brings out the mental gutter, right? I'm going to go into some real specifics. So the first one that can bring it out is sleep deprivation. If you haven't had enough sleep, it's going to come out. The next one is just overall physical exhaustion. So if you're physically just wrecked, you've been going for so long, you're probably going to hit a wall at some point. If you've got inability to control your mind, so like you're not experienced with doing challenges, you're not experienced with hard things, then the more frequent negative thoughts are going to come up than what they probably need to. And then things just like that you would understand, like pain. And then I think the other one to mention that is a little bit, more unorthodox, but is you've come into something with a really unclear why. You're not sure why you want to do this in the first place, because when that why is, quite weak, everything else becomes harder. And that's what I talk about a lot is that, if you think about resilience is overcoming something. But if you think about clarity and knowing your why, and you tend to not need to overcome things as much because it's clearer. So you need to be less resilient for them. And I always try and come back to that because I've done challenges before where, or hard things before where they've been an hour and felt like fucking 24 hours. And then I've done 24-hour things that have, still felt like 24 hours, but have felt a lot easier than what maybe a 6-7 hour could be, right? And the only difference between the two is things like the wants, desires. When you're clear on something, shit is easy. Do not forget that. Okay, so I want you to, out of all the stuff that I'm going to talk about, which I'm going to go into the tips in a second, but the number one thing that I want you to remember about and take away from this episode is that when you hit the gutter, no matter what, it does go away. And the gutter itself, like when you hit that wall, if you just wait it out and don't make any drastic decisions, it will move. I've hit points in 24-hour challenges where I've hit 3 or 4 gutters over the 24-hour period. Maybe I hit an anxious gutter 6 hours in. Maybe at 9 hours in, I've got a pain gutter. And then at that 2 a.m. mark, I've got a mixture of all 3 of those bastards. And every single time I've hit these now, I've realized this always leaves. You just have to be able to do things to essentially put it aside until it goes away. And when you haven't moved past these things before, or you haven't done a long challenge before, or done something, really, really hard, you think that when you're in that, it's going to stay forever. And that can be really demoralizing. But the reality is it's not going to stay forever. So you just have to fucking sack up and just move past it. But these are some of the tactics now that you can use to actually pull yourself past it. So the first one is acceptance. So acceptance is something I use for myself when I'm in the shit, in the gutter, face full of shit. I basically just try and remember why I've chosen this. And I accept my circumstances. Okay, Ethan, you're 30Ks into a 40K run. Stop trying to resist it. Stop trying to overthink it. Stop trying to think about how long you got left. Just accept that you're here and enjoy it. And kind of like reminds yourself to just, I don't know, it's almost like there's a weight lifted off your shoulders when you do that. It's accepting the controllables, it's accepting the uncontrollables. Whatever happens. You're just there. And it kind of frees you from the moment and can sometimes release some of that anxiety. And I think that you finding your way to kind of finding something you can say to yourself to accept it. For me, that is, you chose this. Don't complain about it because you chose this. But you need to find a way for yourself to be able to go in and accept it when you're in the moment. Now, the second one is finding your present. Finding your present, right? Although it sounds a little bit holistic, airy-fairy here, finding your present is all about not thinking about something, right? Being truly present is like a sense of nothingness. It just is what it is. And you can't be present if you're thinking about your pain in your knee. You can't be present when you're overthinking how long you've got left. But when you're with your breath, when you're focusing on sounds, just, general sounds, if you're thinking about your movement, if you're thinking about like box breathing, if you're counting to 100, things like that help bring you to the present. And if you're focusing on even just like counting to 100, for example, like 1, 2 with your breath, like looking around, and you just keep coming back to that, you can't think about how fucking miserable this is or how long this is going to take and how shit you feel, can you? So that's why being present is like the number one thing for exercise. And I'm a big advocate of this. People's mentality around doing hard things is always like push through. But a lot of the time that it creates friction, where if you're just focusing on just nothingness and you get really good at being in a meditative state, then things feel easier. And I think exercise or long endurance events especially, the more you can be in that meditative state, the better. Now, the third one is what you hear about most of the time, or the one that people like Goggins refer to quite a bit, which is like revisiting your personal foundation or revisiting your why or your meaning behind it, or essentially you're digging deep inside yourself to pull out some type of meaning and purpose or some type of value that is going to help you pull through it, right? And that's where I was talking about before about like having a stronger foundation comes from knowing your foundation. And being able to pull upon a strong foundation is important, especially in times of the shit. So an example of that would be, for me, like I like to say things like legacy type statements. So how do I want to be remembered? Do I want to be remembered as the person that gives up on a challenge? Do I want to be remembered as the person that doesn't give 100%? I'm not the type of person that's going to stop. Just, I did this because of this, whatever it is, right? Pulling upon that personal foundation has a lot of power, but only if you've done that kind of groundwork to understand what your personal foundation is. And there's things you can do to kind of cheat this system as well. I remember when I did 24 hours of burpees, I wrote a letter to myself. This was like my first proper endurance event, right? Like I'd done a marathon before it, but apart from that, I was very, very fresh to anything hard, right? 24 hours of burpees. I remember getting about 12 hours in. I was in the pain gutter, depression gutter, anxious gutter, the whole bloody works. Not in a good state at all. My hands were all torn off, blood on my knuckles, and yep, classic everything else downstairs was messed up too. But I remember reading this letter, and it's almost like I just got this sense of just complete clarity of why I was doing it, and then a sense of power came quickly after that. And that's just a really good example of why you've got to have a personal foundation. Now, the fourth one, the best one, my favorite one, is force a physiological response. This one is the best, right? Because you look like a psychopath, but it feels mad, it works, and it's 100% the one that I use the most. Well, actually, I use all of them fucking a lot, so it's hard to say that, right? Finding your presence, probably the main one you try and do over a long period of time, and then you use the other ones to pull yourself out of the shit when it starts getting really bad. So force a physiological response. What does that actually mean, right? You might have heard things like when you smile, it creates certain happiness hormones. Same for like power posing, can help you feel confident. So things like laughing, power posing, smiling, screaming, like embodying a feeling, acting out a feeling so that you actually feel it. Now, what this does is when you're in the shit and you feel like dog shit and you put your hands in the air and you're power posing and you're going, breathing in and you're like sucking in that confidence, you're screaming, you're smiling, is you actually can feel things change in your physiological state. You feel things like endorphins, you feel things like, adrenaline coming through. Sometimes you can feel even gratitude, a sense of like happiness. That can all happen from that, that physiological force state through acting out those things. So for me, what I like to do is my number one thing there is I've actually paired that up with my alter ego as I do hands above the head, like deep breath in, suck it in, and that kind of brings this new sense of life into me. Now, so that's it. Those are the four things, right? But if you think about all of these things, they're all useful in every other way, every other thing in life. It doesn't have to be you want to do 24 hours of burpees. It doesn't have to be a marathon. You could do this from an ice bath perspective. You can focus on your breath in the ice bath. You can, before you have a hard conversation, you can walk into the mirror and give yourself a fucking mad power pose, right? I talk about these things from like an exercise point of view, but a lot of the lessons I've learned have come from non-exercise related activities, books, things like that. So anyway, those are the 4 things that you can do to essentially pull yourself out of the shit and make sure you don't give up on a challenge. And that's all. But if you've got a second, give it a review, share it, all that shit, and I would really appreciate it. Thank you.